Teshile, and welcome back to week 2 of our course on What Did the Buddha Say? This week we're moving on to the book from Bikkhu Bodi, the book titled In the Buddha's Words. And this is an anthology of verses and stories from a collection of things from the different Nikayas that we talked a little bit about last week. But I'm going to start here with some notes from the introduction, the general introduction to the book, and it overlaps a little bit with what we talked about last week, but try to eliminate too much of the duplication here in terms of the ideas that are described. But there are a few other things that are unique to the idea here from this particular book. And so part of the story is that the early followers of the Buddha, after he had died, became concerned as some of the arhats, the more realized beings, began to die. And they were concerned about preservation of the teachings that he had given. And so they began to collect and edit those so that they could use them for listening to the stories, to develop their retention of them, and memorization and repetition. And so there was a strong effort made to be able to sustain those. Now, this is still an oral tradition at this point. They didn't get written down for some time, as best we know. There are a few that we have, as I mentioned last week, that have been preserved, and but they're only little bits and pieces until maybe 200-300 years ago. But presumably from the Theravada tradition, they, after they had gone to Sri Lanka, did actually write down their canon, which became the first and only complete canon in a single language and so forth. We'll talk more about that here momentarily. And yet that was still done around 100 CE. So that's a good, give or take, 600 years after the time of the Buddha, 500 or 600 years in there. The first collections appeared to have been organized into 9 different sets, which Bikkhu Bodi describes here in the text. But this became superseded by the current format of the Nikayas. There are 5 different Nikayas, and also known as Agamas. And we mentioned those last week. And so we'll talk, he describes in here the content of those collections. We briefly introduced that last week. And so there was a Buddhist council that got together, although some scholars believe, the really question, I guess would be more appropriate, whether this actually ever happened or not. But at least according to the later stories, it happened. And they got together with the 500 best arhats, those are the most knowledgeable and so forth, and agreed to recite the verses from the Vinaya, the rules for monks and nuns, as well as the what we now know as the Nikayas, or the Sutras, the speeches, teachings, and so forth of the Buddha, and in some cases his closest disciples. And so they did that, and so these collections that were put together here were 300 or 400 years after they were committed in writing the teachings to ensure that they would continue in Sri Lanka in the 1st century, possibly earlier in India, not really known. These things were written down. So it went quite a while without having an actual written tradition. One of the things that we know about oral traditions is that they're generally not really reliable unless there's a written version that can go back to verify the validity of the oral versions that are being done. They tend to change more often. Now, that's not to say that written traditions don't change. Certainly we know that they also change over time. If you just looked at the 4 Christian Gospels, for example, those are about one story, and the gap between the time of the life of Jesus and the time that those were written down is much shorter than the time between the life of the Buddha and the time that these were written down into a full collection. But we'll look at some of the other versions of things other than just the Pali Canon a little bit later on in the course. So we know both verbal and written traditions do have a habit of changing a little bit. It can be because of mistakes that were made, because prior to automated kinds of printing formats, things were written down one person at a time, and so mistakes could be made. Or sometimes they were colored a little bit in order to reflect the beliefs of a particular group within the variety of practitioners of a particular religious or other kind of practice. And so, given that, we know that there are changes that have been made. Although Bikkhu Bodi points out that when you look at the actual collection of the words of the Buddha, there's actually not that much difference among the different sources that we do have for that. So apparently they did a fairly good job of memorizing the actual words of the Buddha. The commentaries, on the other hand, tend to vary a bit from one tradition to another and so forth. So a remarkably good collection of things. So then he goes on to talk more specifically here about the Pali Canon per se, and he mentions that it's the only complete collection that was done that has survived. There may have been other collections, but this is the only one that has survived. And remember, we're talking about palm leaves in a humid climate, and things just don't survive very well. And the oldest things that we do have survived in part because they were written not on palm leaves, although I guess some of them were, but most of them were written on bark of a tree rather than palm leaves, which tend to survive better. And the best ones that we do have were put in a sealed container and were stored in somewhere in the Middle East where it's much drier climate, and so you don't have that problem with humidity and so forth. So the Theravada school, which, as we talked about last week, was not one of the 18 schools, but a development that came out of one of those 18 schools and moved to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE and spread from there to other parts of Southeast Asia. So the Pali Canon does not mean that they are all dated from the same period. So they could have been written down at different times, and they are necessarily more ancient, nor that they're more ancient than the counterparts from other Buddhist schools. So we don't know the exact timing of these things. One of the arguments, for example, that you may be familiar with has to do with the Theravada school claiming to be the oldest and the most authentic of the Buddha's actual teachings, as opposed to Mahayana, which uses similar kinds of teachings, and some of those things are actually found in the Pali Canon, and is said to have developed later. But the Mahayana tradition says that it actually developed from the time of the Buddha. It was just a different set of teachings that he gave in some cases, not all cases. So there are those arguments that go on, and even in the Sri Lanka area, we know that the Theravada tradition had 3 sub-schools as a part of that we talked about last week. And one of those sub-schools is the one that has continued, but the other 2, which include practices of Mahayana, and one of them included practices of Tantra, were quashed by the government, and so they were eliminated, and just the fact that they were there and in existence at that time indicates that some of this happened at a very early age. The Mahayana and the Tantra occurred at a very early age as well. But that's a different story and a different class at some point. So in this, he gives some reasons why this is a particular valuable collection. The first one is that it is complete and it is from a single school, so that you don't get variation going here and there depending on the particular school writing that, and it's more consistent in that regard. The second one is that the entire collection has been preserved in a Middle Indo-Aryan language. Here he mentioned that the word Pali actually means text, it's not a language per se, but it's treated very much as a language today, not a particular issue. The third one is that it is an authoritative for one contemporary Buddhist school. So this is carried forward to today, and we have this one particular school which helps provide some consistency in it and how it's treated. He then goes on to talk about the four Nikayas, the main four. The first one is a compilation of the discipline, or the Vinaya, the rules for monks and nuns that we've mentioned. The second one are the Sutras, which are the collection of discourses, primarily from the Buddha, but in some cases from some of his disciples, the closest disciples. And then we have the Abhidhamma, which is the compilation of philosophy, psychology, cosmology, those types of things, which was developed and written down sometime later to explain some of the things that were in the sutras. So the collections, those four main collections, include the Digha, the Digha Nikaya, which is the long discourses, then the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the middle-length discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya, which is the connected discourses, and the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the numerical discourses. And I will apologize for my attempt to pronounce some of these words from the Pali, or Sanskrit for that matter. I'm not a master of those languages at all. So the first one of those, the long discourses, is largely aimed at popular audiences and to attract potential converts. The second one, the middle-length discourses, are largely directed inward toward the Buddhist community to acquaint newly ordained monks with the doctrines and practices. The third one is organized by subject matter, so that there are themes that are similar to each other, and so those little sub-collections are included here. So they're referred to as the connected discourses, although he points out that it's not always exactly clear how those things are related. It may just be a word, even though the use of the word and the real content is quite different from each other. And then the fourth one is arranged according to a numerical scheme, and so here a lot of these things will talk about the 1 point, or there's 2 things, or 3s or 4s. So there's different chapters in this collection. So we have the chapter of the 1s, the chapter of the 2s, the chapter of the 3s, and so forth. There's a part of that all the way up to the chapter of the 11s. And so this includes a notable proportion of sutras that were addressed to lay followers as well. So that's important for us who are lay followers of the tradition. There is also, I mentioned there were 5 Nikayas, and so the 5th Nikaya is called the Khuddaka Nikaya, and this means the minor collection. But this became actually the most voluminous of all of the 5. Things kept getting added to that over time, and so more and more things were included as a part of that. But at the heart is a small collection of short works composed almost entirely in verse, like the Dhammapada that we took a look at last week a little bit, and then one called Theragatha and Gata, or mixed prose and verse together. And so the style and contents of these suggest that they are of great antiquity. So some of these may be actually the oldest sources that we have available as a part of this, although they've been, like I mentioned, written over and over again, may include some changes that were done. Other texts in this collection also tend to represent the standpoint of the Theravada school, and so probably something that we would normally expect into that case, since this is their collection, and so they would want to emphasize their particular view of these things. So that is a brief overview from Bikkhu Bodi about the way that these things are constructed. So for today, our primary text is going to be on the human condition. So we'll take a short break and then come back to that.